inform you that this meeting is being recorded and it will appear on Shelter Cymru's YouTube channel. So if you don't want your names or your images on that recording, please switch your cameras off and make any adjustments that you think necessary for those purposes. But it also helps Shelter Cymru as they write the briefing papers, which will follow the meetings in due course. So Joshua Ryan Collins here is the head of finance and macroeconomics at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London. He's author of the book Why Can't You Afford a Home? And some of you who were here a couple of minutes ago will have heard that I mentioned it's another book that I'm certainly going to have to buy and read in order to improve my understanding of the situation, and I'd encourage everybody else to do so as well. So as you all understand, these meetings are an hour long. We have to limit them to an hour. So we want to give enough time at the end for any questions and answers, because I know there will be plenty of questions from Joshua's presentation. So without further ado, unless Jenny Bibbings from Shelter here has anything else to add, we'll go over to Joshua. Okay, Josh. We're on mute at the moment. Josh, there you go.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. My laptop is making a whirring noise. It's got a bit hot in the hot weather. Thank you very much for joining this morning and listening to me for 20 minutes or so. Just to give you a few words of introduction, I'm an associate professor in economics and finance at University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We are a institute set up by Mariana Mazzucato about 5 years ago now, and we focus very much on public policy and economic policy and rethinking the role of the state to meet the sort of grand challenges facing the world. One of which, of course, is housing affordability, which you'll know all about, given Wales' current challenges. Of course, it's a much broader problem than that, and what I'll do today is try and draw on some lessons from other countries as well about how we might meet the challenge. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you can all see that. Is that okay? Everyone can see?
Yes.
So I put in a nice picture of, I think it's Carmarthenshire there for you. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about work based on these books, really, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, published in 2017, a more recent book called Why Can't You Afford a Home, and an article which I think will be circulated to you as well. So, I mean, the big challenge we're grappling with really is kind of in the housing market anyway, is why does the housing market appear to be programmed in a completely different way from the rest of the economy? So we saw the economy collapsing during COVID-19, massive drop in GDP, and house prices carried on rising. In fact, they grew faster in some cases. And now we're seeing something quite similar. So with the disastrous cost of living crisis that we're enduring, we've had falls in real income, evidence of a recession shortly going to hit us. I think most people are in agreement. The energy crisis reducing will eventually really start to hit consumption. Yet again, house prices are on the up. So the UK recorded the fastest rise in 18 years last week. I was actually writing a piece for the Observer that I had to change when these figures were released last week, because we did actually have 3 months of falling growth, but still growth. But this was reversed with the latest figures. In Wales, I had a bit of a look before the presentation. You've actually got, Wales is actually one of the fastest growing regions in terms of house price rises recently over the last few months in the UK. And I've got here some data from the Principality Building Society showing the areas with the fastest growth, Carmarthenshire, I won't be able to pronounce these areas properly, so excuse me, but Monmouthshire, something pretty crazy is going on, Merthyr Tydfil. But in general, you've been having around 10% over the year price growth, and when you think that real wages have essentially been stagnant, that is a serious problem for middle income and lower income people looking to get on the housing ladder. Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture, I guess. And the question is, what do we do about it? I think it's worth stepping back though, and just thinking about why house prices appear to be immune to broader declines in the economy. This shows you the chart on the left, real house prices in some of the major economies in the world. You can see as I said, the impact of COVID not leading to a fall in house prices, but rather to a sort of spike. And you can also see the financial crisis didn't have much of an impact on falling house prices. And the chart on the right just shows you different types of housing in the US and how over the period of the pandemic, all types of housing, whether it was a flat or a bigger house, actually this is population density, but essentially the story is that it seems to be a generalized phenomenon. If you look at the long run house price to income ratio, which is a sort of best measure of affordability, you can see here something that looks like a sort of equilibrium from the mid 70s up to the late 1990s. There's a bit of volatility, but the black line shows the long run average, by the way. And this is across, I think, 16 high income economies averaged out. But you see the big bubble up to the financial crisis in 2008. But then what you don't see is a return to that equilibrium level. You see rather a dip, housing becoming a bit more affordable, but then taking off again from about 2013 onwards. So if you're going to explain the cause of rising house prices, you've got to be able to explain why in most countries we've had this very substantial rise in house prices relative to incomes from the late 1990s onwards. That's the sort of key phenomenon that needs to be explained. Now, one of the most common explanations is that we're just not building enough homes. And this is an explanation that politicians on both the left and the right seem to have agreed on. There seems to be some consensus on this, which is unusual, obviously, and interesting. So on the left, the argument is usually we're not building enough social housing, low-income housing, and I have quite a lot of sympathy with that argument, but I don't think it really captures the problem properly. On the right, the argument is generally it's a problem with the planning system. We need to liberalise the planning system to sort of let the market produce more housing relative to meet demand. Now, if it was the case that we just weren't building enough homes, that there just wasn't enough places for people to live, in terms of housing as a consumption good, a place where you have a service, one would of course expected rents to have risen relative to incomes in just the same way that house prices have. But what this chart shows you is that that's not the case. Actually, house prices have risen even faster against rents than they have against incomes. So rents have more or less tracked incomes. House prices in both cases have risen much faster. So from that perspective, if you think about housing, as a consumption good, something that you consume as a service, supply doesn't seem to be a very good explanation. Undersupply also doesn't seem to explain housing bubbles and housing volatility in house prices very well at all. Now, there's lots of examples of this, but this is probably my favorite one. It shows you the two countries that had the biggest house price booms in Europe, possibly the world, during the financial crisis, in the lead up to the financial crisis. Ireland in the green and Spain in the red. And you can see that precipitous rise of over sort of 200% from the late 90s onwards, and then a big crash just after the financial crisis. Were Ireland and Spain building less homes, maybe, than other European countries during this period, during this run-up to this enormous growth, this enormous bubble? No, they were building 3 times as many as the average European country, 3 times as many homes. So clearly it wasn't a supply problem that led to that enormous bubble. Essentially, the supply argument doesn't add up. It doesn't add up if you actually look at the facts as well, in terms of what's happening in the UK context. With regard to the planning argument, around 90% of planning applications in the UK are approved. There was no drop-off during the pandemic period to speak of. The UK actually has a surplus of dwellings relative to households, which has grown by about 70% from 660,000 to over 1 million since the mid-1990s. And so there's not much evidence of that. Maybe you could argue there hasn't been enough homes built in the right areas, and that if you look at averages, this doesn't give you the right perspective. But even if you accept that, supply is part of the explanation, all the evidence suggests that expanding the housing stock has extremely limited effect on actual housing affordability. So there's been some estimates by MHCLG which show a 1% increase in housing stock delivers around 1 or 2% reduction in house prices. Now, if you extrapolate that, the implication is that if you increase the supply of housing by around 20%, which is the government's plan, essentially, over the next 20 years, approximately 5 million homes, this would reduce prices by somewhere between 20 and 40%, roughly, very, very roughly. But the increase in house prices we've had over the last 20 years is 213%. So it's going to make very, very little difference to house prices, assuming we have the continuation in the current rates of growth that we're currently seeing. So all of the evidence suggests supply is not really helping us understand what's going on here. So what about demand? Because that's the other side of the equation, obviously. There are 2 main forms of demand for housing, and they are quite tangled up. So it's quite hard to disentangle them, particularly for primary residences. As I said, housing is a consumption good. It's a place to live, to bring up a family. It's a place to literally physically occupy, to enable you to get to work in a sensible fashion. But it's also a financial asset and a store of value. It's a way of growing your wealth and a way of holding your wealth relatively securely, a way of passing your wealth on to your family, certainly in terms of a primary residence. And the other point about housing is that it has a high income elasticity of demand. That's a technical term, but what it basically means that as your income increases, we have a tendency to spend relatively more of our income on housing and domestic space relative to other goods. So once you bought 20 pairs of shoes, the value of an additional pair of shoes is pretty small in most cases. Certain exceptions probably amongst your teenage sons and daughters, but for most people, you get a certain amount of stuff you don't need anymore. With housing, it's not like that. Housing is we always want a bigger garden. We always want to maybe live nearer to the better school or the nicer environment, by the sea, by a park. And for that reason, as our incomes increase, we spend more money on housing, and there's some studies which show this. Now, the demand for housing as a financial asset is, I think, the key explanation, along with this rising income, people spending more money as their incomes rise. because the demand for housing as a financial asset is not just to do with your income, it's to do with your ability to borrow, to get hold of credit. And of course, your willingness to do so will also be affected by interest rates, and how much you're going to be taxed on any property that you own. And these factors lead people to form expectations as well about future price rises, which of course also influence their decision making. Now, buying property has been a pretty good bet over the last 150 years. Some research that shows the average return is around 7% in high income economies. Now, that is similar to investments in the stock market, but it's much less volatile. So the returns don't tend to bounce around as you get with the stock market, and it's obviously significantly higher than investments in other types of safe assets, such as government bonds, which is more like, I think, 4%. So for all of these reasons, housing is a valuable financial asset, as well as being a key consumption good. Now, my main argument really is that we need to really put much more attention on the role of land and finance in understanding the current situation and the housing affordability crisis. These are two phenomena not very well understood in economics and economic theory. But if you think about their key properties, they are strangely inverse, and that means that they attract, a bit like magnets getting attracted to each other. So if you think about land, the supply of land is highly inelastic, particularly when you think about land as in terms of desirable location, right? So it's sort of location through space and time. That's what land actually is. And as I said, actually, there's only so much you can do in terms of building more homes, because everybody actually wants to live in the same kinds of places. So, you can only build so many skyscrapers, and you can only build out from the city centre so far before people start saying, it's taking me too long to get to work. I want to live in the centre. I want to live near the decent job. I want to live near the sea, or near the, the nice place with the nice facilities or the good schools. So it's inherently, the supply is inherently limited for that reason. And that's why it is difficult to bring more supply of housing on tap quickly. Whereas finance is the opposite. Finance is highly inelastic. Banks create money out of nothing, essentially, basically based on people, their confidence in your ability to pay back the loan. We've seen a huge growth in capital investment as well, capital market investment over the last sort of 20 years. Land is fixed and immobile. Finance flows around the world, highly mobile. Land will typically appreciate in value as the economy grows, and anyone who owns land, property owners, can capture that value by charging higher rents or by seeing the value of their property increase over time, capital gains. This is rent extraction. This is land rent extraction. That's what the classical economists talked about. And partially for that reason, and also because of its other properties being immobile, it's a very good source of collateral, land and property, for the banking sector. Banks are looking for secure assets to back their loans by, in case you can't pay the money back. And property happens to be essentially the best type of asset to reduce that risk. And as I said, there's these conflicting roles, economic roles, for both land, but also finance. Finance can support capital investment. Money goes to a business, enables that business to innovate, to pay workers, to grow, and that can create more income in the economy, and you get a sort of positive cycle. But it can also, money can flow from the banking sector into existing assets like property and pump up the value of those assets and generate more demand. And this is what we've seen in the UK since the deregulation of the banking system in the 1980s. We saw this enormous growth in domestic mortgage credit. So that's the blue line here, and the dotted line is real house prices on the right-hand scale here. Whereas lending to businesses, a so-called textbook role of the banking sector, you can see as a percentage of GDP that increases from sort of around 10 or 12% to maximum 22%, whereas mortgage debt goes from around 20% all the way up to 70% by the time of the financial crisis. So explosion in mortgage debt, rising at a much faster rate than incomes, all flowing into this inelastic supply of property and land. Of course, we had rising house prices. Similar picture more generally. This chart shows the same data across, I think, 14 high-income economies. And again, late 1990s, you see this enormous increase in mortgage credit, and business lending just sort of stays around the same. And that increase drives this rise in house prices. There's lots of studies that show when you deregulate a housing market, you get this flood of credit flowing into, when you deregulate the banking system, you get this flood of credit going into property because banks like to lend against property, secure lending, and that generates more increases, which attracts more credit. That chart just shows you the period of deregulation. Now, along with that, we've had this secular fall in interest rates. Interest rates on average going from about sort of 3 or 4% in the 2000s all the way down to essentially zero or negative real interest rates in recent years. They're going up again now because we've finally got some inflation, but that just makes the cost of borrowing, of course, the risk attached to borrowing much more affordable. And the other major thing we have is these huge subsidies for homeowners. So no capital gains on your primary residence. So in a sense, unlike any other financial asset, you don't pay any capital gains on property. Council tax has not been revalued since the early 1990s. We don't pay imputed rent, so that's a tax on the use of your home that is based on the average rent in the area where you own your home. We used to have that in the UK up until the 1960s. They still have imputed rent taxes, I think, in the Netherlands and Switzerland. So it's just a way of saying if you're a renter or a homeowner, you'll pay the same amount of money for the right to occupy this parcel of land, but that's been got rid of. And then we've had a whole swathe of first-time buyer subsidies, which you'll all know about, and forms of tax relief, including on second homes. You can offset your tax, your interest payments for second homes against tax. All of this leads to what I've talked about as a housing finance cycle, which I've tried to capture in this slightly complicated flow diagram. But essentially, you have the deregulation of the financial system. You get all of this credit flowing into property. You have these very tax-friendly policies on that asset, and subsidies. At the same time, you have a weakening social housing, public housing offer, and all of this naturally leads to increasing speculative demand for residential property. And as people's so in a sense, you unlike all other commodities, most commodities, if the price goes up to a certain level, the demand falls, assuming you have competitive markets. It's not the case with housing. With housing, as the price goes up, the demand increases. The demand for housing as a financial asset increases. More credit is borrowed, more money flows into this supply of land, prices rise, and on we go, essentially. And a lot of financial innovation as well, in terms of the role of securitized mortgages play an important role. So that's the sort of rather gloomy prognosis. What can we do differently? Some countries have managed to avoid this rapid increase in housing house price to income ratios. Germany and Korea are two that have. What are they doing differently? Well, one thing that they do is have a policy framework that captures land rents much more effectively than we have here in the UK. This is just a simple diagram that tries to capture what I'm talking about here. You open a new rail link. Imagine a high-speed rail link from London to Cardiff. I know it's never going to happen, but just imagine it did happen. House prices in Cardiff would shoot up in all the places along that train line. In England, they'd shoot up, obviously. Who deserves to get that value? Should it be just people who own private homes along that line? No, of course it shouldn't, because that's an investment by the state using our taxpayers' money. It should be captured by the state and used for further investment and to support affordable housing and ensure that everyone benefits from that sort of public investment. Now, many countries practice this kind of operation, but we don't do it very well, if at all, in the UK. There are a range of different ways you can capture land value and land rents. Probably the most obvious one is taxation. So a land value tax is probably, most economists would agree, is the best option. That's where you tax the incremental increase in the value of the land, or usually on an annual basis. So it essentially captures the increase in value in the area where you live. So if you put in a new kitchen in your house, you're not going to be taxed more money because that doesn't affect the land value. But if somebody puts in a new railway station or great new school opens up, you'll have to pay a bit more for the right to occupy land near that increasingly useful facility, essentially. Another option is public ownership and public land banking. And there are various other tools that I'm happy to talk about in more depth. Just on the land value tax, I think a key thing here is to think about the salience of the tax. So where do you take it away from people? If you just talk about throwing a check in the post, it's never going to be a goer politically. You need to think about taking it from people's income, withdrawing it from income, perhaps, as we do with Social Security at the moment. And I would also think about reforming other types of tax, so reform council tax, reduce income tax or corporation tax even, to make it politically more acceptable. Ownership and tenure, there's actually very little evidence that suggests private home ownership is economically better than other forms of tenure. In Singapore, one of the most economically successful countries in the world, 90% of the land is owned by the state, which makes long leases to private sector and has a very effective public mortgage system. South Korea has a huge land corporation that controls half of residential commercial development. And in Germany and Switzerland, essentially you have tenure neutrality, as I was talking about. Community land trusts, I know this is quite a vibrant movement in Wales. This is a model which captures land value, socialises the land rent for the community in the area where it's based. Clear challenges around getting hold of enough land in the first place and then leveraging credit. And then structural reforms to the banking system, which I think is probably more challenging in Wales, given many of the banks that are lending are probably not based in Wales. So I won't talk too much about that, but I suppose these are the areas where maybe the Welsh policymakers should be thinking. I know there's a huge problem with rural areas, so I think higher taxes on second homes are a very good idea. I think there's already something happening on that front. Maybe rent regulation, because I know rents have been a challenge as well, linking local rents to local wages. Using the planning tools that you have to encourage more non-market development, supporting community land trusts and public housing. And whatever you do, don't sell off public land and housing that you do own, because this is going to increase in value over time, almost inevitably. And you can use that to borrow and to capture land rents in the way I've been talking about. So yeah, that's it for me. I want to keep it short so we have plenty of time for questions. But this is a sort of summary. Essentially, the land market needs to be thought about as a very monopolistic, imperfect market where it's very easy for big players to get control, and that can be supported by the financial system. And if you're not careful, you'll lose control of house prices very, very quickly. So I would argue for a much stronger role for the state in market shaping and planning. Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic, Josh. Thank you very much. For those of you just tuning in now, have a look at the further reading there, take a note, because there's plenty of information there for us to take away. And Jenny, will we have these slides to share with participants?
If Josh is happy for us to do
Yeah,
so.
yeah. You can share the PDF, no problem. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll circulate afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we'll have that information. Okay, so any questions with anybody? You'll see on your Teams panel there, there's a reactions icon, and you can select a little hand raising of your hand. So anybody with any questions? And I see Matthew Dix there, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Mabon, and thanks, Josh. Very, very interesting presentation. I think, you've hit the nail on the head. I think the elephant in the room is always about land capture and land capture value in terms of, influencing the housing market. So 2 questions from me really on that. First of all, how can the Welsh government has previously brought forward proposals on land value capture, one of the 4 taxes that it was talking about 5 or 6 years ago, and I think the First Minister has spoken about it publicly before. How would you advise the Welsh government to sort of go down that route, to avoid the sort of, perennial response of, well, all the developers will just not bother developing here, go over the border, etc., because it's unlikely that we're going to get that approach in England, and ultimately, it's a paradigm shift we're talking about in terms of driving down the capitalisation of the housing market, which, as you say, is fundamentally the problem. So how do we persuade the public to come with us on this journey when 75%, 80% of us are homeowners, and although you say 40% isn't a massive cut in house values in relation to the 230% hike since in the last 20 years or so, it's I wouldn't fancy seeing 40% off the value of my home. So those 2 questions.
I think on the latter point, I think what we've got to aim for is not a sort of collapse in house prices, which would be disastrous, obviously, especially given the dependency of the financial sector on house prices. We can't have, banks will just stop lending to small businesses completely if house prices start to fall. So we've got to avoid that. What we need is a gradual sort of relinking of house price growth to income growth, and a bit of a gradual fall initially, I think will be necessary as well to sort of bring it back to some sort of stability. And the best way to do that is to have higher incomes, and a sort of gradual leveling off in house prices. But I totally appreciate the challenge. The challenge is enormous for politicians to kind of face up to the reality of saying we've got to de-link the whole economy from ever rising house price growth. I think in places like Wales, where you have more limited powers, then it's even more challenging. But what I would probably recommend is looking at doing things like limiting the ability of people to buy second homes, particularly if they're not, they're just for their own benefit to go on holiday and stuff like that, and they're not actually a proper business. You've got to reduce the sort of demand for housing, both as a consumption good or the sort of overconsumption of housing, I guess is how I would describe it. You need to think about housing as more like water, right? It's like a utility that's in limited supply, and everyone needs to have a basic level of it. Okay, that's what policy has to target. If people want to have more than that basic level, they just have to pay for it. At the moment, they're not paying for it. They're just getting these enormous subsidies to have more and more space that's in finite supply. So it's a totally inequitable system to subsidize rich people, both through the mortgage market and through the tax system, to overconsume space. And then on the financial side, we've got to reduce the demand for housing as a financial asset. And it's the same types of policies, essentially. But for local governments, if local government, which I understand you can in Wales, you can borrow at fairly cheap interest rates, I would be looking to buy larger plots of land where you can, and use any rules that allow you to, if there's any compulsory purchase powers, to buy larger plots of land where you can get sort of greater scale effects, to create mixed communities where you have genuinely affordable housing, and you have market housing, and you use the market housing to subsidize the affordable housing. That's the sort of model that's used in Europe all the time. It's completely normal, and it's normal to have the public sector as playing a sort of market shaping and land ownership type model, determining the use of the land as well. You have businesses there as well, but this idea that the private sector will sort it out for us is just complete nonsense. There's no incentive on the private sector to build housing and sell housing in a way that will be affordable, because they just don't make enough money out of it. Right? It's just not. They're just, they're focused on quarterly returns to the shareholders. They're not interested in building family homes or the types of housing where people can actually afford. So that really needs to be just forgotten about. There's no evidence that it works. Builders don't, even if they build the housing, they don't release the housing onto the market if they fear that the price will fall. So then it's never going to be a solution. Bit of a rant, sorry.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. No, that's great to have a rant every time. We've got Thomas Hollick there with his hand up, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentation. I know you mentioned that it's not necessarily a lack of housing, but I feel like maybe you were alluding to this. It's the right type of housing in the right places. So my organisation, we work in homelessness primarily, and one of the big issues we see is a real shortage of one-bedroom properties. It'd be for rent, but they're not being built for buy-to-let landlords or social sector either. So I was just wondering if there's anything in terms of maintain the link between maintaining control over land, whether that's local authority or whatever, and mentioned there just about determining usage of land. Is there any examples of trying to use that control to encourage more development of properties and accommodation which actually meets the needs of people locally?
Well, I think community land trusts have got a pretty good record on these sort of mixed use developments. Housing associations in the UK, there are some good examples, but I think they've been pushed towards a more commercialized sort of model, partially because of the pressures on their own budgets from government. Yeah, I think there are some good examples around the world. Some of those examples I put on the last slide, I think could be useful. I think I think what we need to do is sort of get away from the idea of affordable housing being a sort of only for the sort of people in the worst conditions in society. Because politically that's a really difficult thing to push forward, that you need to pay more tax to help people who are homeless. What we need to do is get towards the idea of, as I said, this idea that everyone has a right to a basic level of housing, a basic amount of space, 35 square meters, however you want to define it. Everyone has a right to that, and that should be introduced as a kind of more like a law. And then it doesn't become about whether or not people have a job, or people are drug addicts, or all this kind of these negative labels, we're homeless, whatever. It's just people have a right. If you want to consume more of this limited space, you have to pay for it, and obviously those kind of taxes can help budgets to provide more space for of the type and the use that are needed, really. But I think local authorities need to kind of re-embrace their role as the key providers of this right, and start really investing also in capacity building in terms of how you do this, working with housing associations and the like, because this is a way to really make a difference to people's lives. And it's the Conservative governments have sort of eroded that capacity over the years, and it's going to be tough to get it back, but I think that's the only way forward, really.
Thanks, Josh. Tom, does that answer the query?
Yes, in part, I think it's just, yeah, I'm really keen on that idea about encouraging any tools to kind of encourage producing more affordable but appropriate homes. So it's the 1-bedroom flats that are, or 1-bedroom houses that are not necessarily luxury bachelor pads. They are homes that are affordable within range for people who are, you know, starter tenancies, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom. I see, Shane, you've got your hand up, but before we get to you, Jenny has a question on the chat function. Remember, you can use the chat function as well if you so wish. Jenny, can I ask you to raise your point and ask your question?
Yes, of course. Josh, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the role of the private rented sector. We talk about the demand for mortgages, and partly it's fueled because, of course, people want to own their own home, don't they? So is part of the solution about making the alternatives to home ownership more feasible for people?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that, but I think a key policy intervention must be to improve the rights of tenants. So we have one of the most liberalised private rented sectors in the world, in the UK or in advanced economies. You know, people get thrown out for 6 months very easily. In Germany, you know, it's essentially impossible to get thrown out of your rented accommodation unless you stop paying the rent. And people in Germany, for that reason, rent for life, and they bring up families in rented accommodation. And middle class people do that. It's a completely normal thing to do. Same as Switzerland, because they're protected by law, and they invest in those properties. And the landlords then have really good tenants who keep the homes in good condition. So it's a win-win scenario. In this country, we have a system where, you know, it's all very short-termist again, and the landlord's constantly looking to ramp up prices and kick people out once prices do go up. So yeah, I think much better rights for renters is key, and more onerous requirements on landlords to keep properties in good order. Yeah, I think that's central. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Councillor Shane Cook. Shane, your hands up.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry if you've already answered this, I might have missed it, but you mentioned housing as a financial asset, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the impact of foreign investment in our housing stock, and if we should regulate this more.
Yes, I mean, do you mean by foreign, like outside the UK, or do you mean like rich English people buying second homes?
No, I think more like perhaps Russia, China, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I haven't looked at the data on that. My suspicion is that the bigger problem comes from Londoners buying second homes in very nice parts of Wales. But yeah, there's no particular reason why there shouldn't just be higher taxes generally on anyone, whether they're based in Wales or based in England or based in Russia, buying up a property purely as a financial asset. I'm sort of loath to discriminate against so-called foreigners buying property, when I think often the problem is you know, it's wealthy people in your own country who are more likely perhaps to buy the second home by the seaside, where local people can't afford it. But I'm not that familiar with the data, I have to say. But there's just no reason why we shouldn't tax out of existence people buying second homes purely as financial assets.
Thanks. And does the same apply then to large corporations and companies that come in and buy property as housing? Then would you say that the same policy in principle applies?
Well, that depends on what they're planning on doing, I think. Again, if the plan is just to build lots of posh for wealthy people at market rates, then that needs to be stopped. You know, if it's, for example, a developer who's working with a big pension fund that's looking for long-term, reasonable, sort of low rates for build to rent, you know, maybe there are circumstances there where private investment of that could work. But too many of these build to rent projects, I think, are again based on fairly short-term financial returns, and are pushing up prices in the areas where they're building. And there's lots of examples in the UK where tenants get kicked out as prices are ramped up, and that's that needs to be handled with a lot of care. And that's where you can use your planning rules, planning powers, I think, to ensure that sort of development is effective.
Okay, thank you so much. Sarah Birch.
Thanks. Coming from Monmouthshire, where, as you say, something is going mad. Yeah, how do you see the generational inheritance aspect of this panning out? I mean, is part of it the fact that people are living longer, and they're often living longer in 3-bedroom homes, and they have a strong we have a strong addiction in this country to inheritance, but that inheritance often isn't coming in until those children are in midlife or beyond. So I just wondered how you see that as a factor, and what, if anything, could be done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of inheritance, property inheritance in particular. So I would, if I was Prime Minister, I'd be, implementing a fairly hefty inheritance tax, along with wealth tax and land taxes. It's just a way of perpetuating inequality, essentially. So it's a very important way that we perpetuate inequality in this country. Unfortunately, politically, it's also extraordinarily challenging for policymakers to tackle. Myself, I think a better solution is some sort of property tax that's more focused on the annual increase in land value, because I think in some senses that should put off this more speculative investment in housing as a financial asset, and should reduce the inheritance, the large amount of inheritance that would be passed on anyway. I think politically it's probably a better bet. Ireland introduced a very low property tax at a very low rate a few years ago, successfully, and I think its plan is to sort of gradually ramp it up as people get used to it. And I think that's maybe an option that Wales could explore as well. Start at a very low rate, sneak it in, as it were, and once it's there, typically politicians, when they see a good source of income, will be loath to get rid of it, perhaps.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Was that okay with you, Sarah? Anything back on that?
Yes, no, that's great, but I think it is also about providing alternatives for older people, so that they don't want to necessarily stay in the 4-bedroom family home. Yeah,
I mean, better incentives to downsize, definitely, I think, are useful. But again, a tax, if you had a tax on not just on the value of the home, but maybe on the sort of on the amount of space being consumed, again, that could help older people sort of downsize.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh. And I see Mark Harris has a couple of comments in the comments in the chat function. Mark, would you like to express those here with us verbally at all?
Sorry, turn my mic and camera on. Sorry, busy typing away. I mean, just obviously I work for the Home Builders Federation, so represent private house builders. So I guess it's just a couple of comments back. I mean, the first one was around the fact that we do contribute around 1/3 of the affordable homes in Wales through the Section 106. So it's not the fact that we just build big houses that are expensive. We do make a contribution. The smaller homes point, I don't necessarily disagree with Welsh Government introducing a minimum space standard, but obviously the knock-on impact of that is it costs more to build them and it takes more land, which effectively increases prices. comment about Monmouth's probably driven by the fact that although Welsh prices are going up quicker, they're still cheaper than in England. And as people now can work more remotely, why not move to a nicer place? You know, for the same money, a bigger house. So that's probably driving Monmouth. And I think just about to post, I think that in Ireland you're talking about the vacant land tax, which is being looked at in Wales, but they've run into problems with sort of English government and tax laws. But that's more about driving people to bring forward vacant land for housing, rather than just sitting on it while it makes money. So it's not quite having the same effect. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And before we finish off with you, Josh, because we're running out of time, Carolyn Thomas, well, a Senedd member, I was going to say Assembly there, sorry, Senedd member for North Wales. Carolyn, you've got a comment there. Would you like to share it with us?
Yes, so before I became a member of the Senedd for North Wales, I was a councillor in Flintshire for 14 years, and I was on the planning committee. And I know the policy is 30% affordable housing, but developers will fight back against that, and it's not always achieved, the 30%. And that happens more frequently as well.
And that's a good point there. Thank you, Carolyn. Okay, so we're coming to an end here now. So any final comments from you, Josh, as we wrap up?
Can I come in with one other thing?
Of course you can, Carolyn. I would never stop you.
Thank you. So when Flintshire were looking to increase their own council housing stock, some developers gifted units, and then the council were able to borrow against those gifted units to increase the council housing stock at the early, in the early days. And I thought that was quite a good way. Instead of providing the 30% affordable, they gifted units to the council, and that was something that was negotiated. So I don't know if that's something that could be considered as well.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we will consider and is part of what we're looking at in this series of cross-party group meetings on affordability. So thanks for that, Carolyn. Okay then, so Josh, any other further comments to wrap up before we finish the meeting?
Yeah, so I'll just come back on some of Mark's comments maybe. I think the challenge with the private developer model in this country is you essentially have a sort of what you might call a speculative development model where developers compete. When a local authority decides it needs a development, it sort of advertises it's going to be a development, and then private developers compete to buy the land essentially, and the landowner, of course, will sell the land at the highest possible rate. Because the rules, we have this thing called hope value, which says that the landowner is entitled not to the value of the land in its current use, but its potential future value if it was to be put to the most highest market use, as it were, which usually involves two-bed luxury flats. So what happens is developers compete to buy that land, and of course the incentives for them is to buy it at a rate that enables them to make the biggest profit, and to get the land they often have to reduce the focus on quality and on affordable housing in order to win the sort of competition. What we need is a system where the local authority says, we've got this piece of land, we need this amount of affordable housing, we want to support some businesses in the area, we want some infrastructure. What are you going to give us to do that, essentially? And not necessarily always just selling it to the highest bidder, but to the developer who's actually going to deliver on those public purpose objectives. Now, Section 106, I think, has been reasonably effective over the years in producing some affordable housing. But it's not a solution to that more fundamental speculative home building model where all the incentives for the developer is wrong, basically. So in Europe they have much larger sort of plan making powers where the municipalities have an area of land. They say we want this and this and this, and developers work with them to deliver that. and it's been much more effective in providing affordable housing. So yeah, I'll leave it on that note, I think.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn, Josh. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending this fantastic meeting and presentation by Josh as well. Thank you to Jenny and Dewi of Shelter for organising the meeting and making sure that everything has run smoothly. Just for reference, we have provisionally penciled in the 17th of October, the 6th of February and the 8th of May for the next meetings of the cross-party group on housing, all of them at 9:30 in the morning. They will all be Monday mornings, as you'll notice. So they are provisionally penciled in with us. Please keep those dates in your diaries for the time being. And until the next meeting, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, bye.